It might be on the bookcase. Let's see. All right, Rabosai, good morning. Let us begin. Let's begin by thanking our sponsors for today's shir. Again, Hebron Zoom, you still hear me all right? Okay, excellent, good. Not sure why I'm not. All right, so Ari, thank you so much. Thank you. To thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Tishrei, Avram and Shaindy Kelman, for dedicating all the shiurim and drushos this month in memory of their beloved parents. To thank Jack Bennett for dedicating all the shiurim and drushos this month in memory of Givati Brigade First Sergeant Nikolai Rappaport, and Dr. Linda Weinberg for dedicating the shiurim this month in memory of her husband, Dr. Paul Weinberg Peretz Moshe ben Avraham David. To thank our Week of Learning sponsors, Ira and Miriam Grossman, in commemoration of the yahrzeit. I don't think, maybe just play with the volume. Thank you. In commemoration of the yahrzeit of Ira's father, Melvin Grossman, we hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, the neshamas will have an aliyah and the families a nechama. And I will say with that, let us begin. So we have the incredible zechus today to Emir Hashem begin the third parak of Meseches Beitzah, and Emir Hashem today's daf is Chof Dalid 24. We are going to pick up Emir Hashem at the Mishnah on 23b. The Mishnah says as follows. Says the Mishnah. Sammy, thank you. Is it working? Okay, try it. All right, so the Mishnah says as follows. The Mishnah explains eight. How's that? I think there's something with the volume setting. Yeah. Okay. I'll speak louder. Says the Mishnah, Ein sadin dagim in abivarim b'yamtiv. The halacha is that one is not permitted to go ahead and trap a fish from bivarim. Rashi points out over that bivarim refers to a fish pond. If you look at Rashi says, Ein sadin dagim. Now this is incredibly important. Now remember, the Mishnah is introducing us to this idea that not every malacha that falls into the category of ochal nefesh is permitted on Yom Tiv. So if we look at Rashi says, for example, Ein sadin dagim, af agav de shchita va'afia ubishol mi'avos malachos, saying even though again baking, cooking, shchita are all malachos, v'hutshru l'tzorech Yom Tiv, and nevertheless they are all permitted on Yom Tiv. Taima mishum di efshar me'erev Yom Tiv. The shchita chayish lemichmar bisra pen yischam v'yasriach. Aval tzeda efshar l'tzodo mi'ba'od yom v'nichem mitzudas v'mayim v'lo yamos u'lemachar yitlus. Suppose this is incredible. So says the Mishnah, or says Rashi, the idea is that on Yom Tiv, the heter for ochal nefesh is for the type of malacha which could not have been done before Yom Tiv with the same qualitative results. But if something could have been done before Yom Tiv with the same qualitative results, then there is no heter to perform that malacha on Yom Tiv. So for example, shchita, right? You can't shecht an animal, remember, before refrigeration. You shecht an animal erev Yom Tiv, so by the time Yom Tiv comes, there is the possibility of spoilage. But halacha l'maisa, something like trapping. Trapping could be done on erev Yom Tiv with the same qualitative results. Because of that, halacha l'maisa, there's no reason to permit that malacha on Yom Tiv itself. So for example, they're dealing with fish. So if you wanted to go ahead and trap a fish erev Yom Tiv, keep it in water. In other words, you can keep it alive, because obviously keeping it alive provides the freshness, but lamaisa, there's no need to allow for the trapping itself on Yom Tiv, because the trapping could have been done before Yom Tiv with the same qualitative results. So it says that's why the Mishnah says, Ein tzadin dagim bivarim Yom Tiv. You can't trap a fish on Yom Tiv. You can't trap a fish. Nor can you go ahead and feed the fish. Rashi says over here, So we'll see, this is very interesting. You can't feed fish on Yom Tiv because halacha l'maisa, the fish could go ahead and care for themselves. Even according to the heter that says that you're allowed to engage in ochal nefesh for behemoths, that's only when the obligation for mazonos is upon you. But if the animals are capable of sustaining themselves, then you're not permitted to feed them on Yom Tiv. So the Rashi assumes over here that the fish, this is not talking about fish in your fish tank, right? This is talking about fish out in the water. Lamaisa could scavenge for themselves. Aval, sodin chaya va'of min avivarim. But what can you do? You can go ahead and literally trap a chaya or an oaf that are in some type of bivarin. I will say bivarin literally means like an enclosure. Now what this is referring to over here is if you have an animal that essentially is already halachically considered to be trapped on Yom Tiv. Again, we'll define the parameters of that. But if the animal is already trapped as of Yom Tiv, even though again, it still has some level of mobility, you are permitted to go ahead and specifically or physically trap it on Yom Tiv itself. The nosef name is onos. You can go ahead and feed them as well. Now, if you look at Rashi says over here, "Aval tzadin chayiv ha'of hamichunosim me'esmol." So we're going to see, for example, you could have an animal that is trapped in an enclosure, but the animal again still has mobility. That type of animal, you're permitted to go ahead and capture on Yom Tov itself, because since the animal is in an enclosure, halacha l'maaseh, it is halachically considered to be trapped already. Again, the parameters of that we'll have to see in the Gemara. Rabbi Shimon Omer, lo kol habivarin shavin. Rabbi Shimon says not all enclosures are the same. Ze'aklal, this is the rule. Top of Chaf Daled, kol ha'mechusar tzeidah aser, v'she'enu mechusar tzeidah mutar. Literally, Rabbi Shimon says like, here's the rule. Any animal that is already trapped can be further trapped on Yom Tiv. Any animal that's not trapped cannot be trapped on Yom Tiv. Again, we'll see exactly what that means. But the point over here that I want to drive home, which is an incredible chiddush of our Mishnah, is up until now we've been operating with the idea that ochel nefesh allows for the performance of malacha on Yom Tiv. What our Mishnah introduces us to is the concept that if a malacha could have been done before Yom Tiv with the same qualitative results, there is no heter to perform that malacha on Yom Tiv. So the paradigmatic example of that is going to be trapping fish. You could have trapped the fish on Erev Yom Tiv, kept it in the water, kept it alive, because obviously freshness is an element over here. But since you could have gone ahead and trapped it on Erev Yom Tiv, therefore, halacha l'maisa, no heter to trap on Yom Tiv. Good. Says the Gemara, Urmini will ask a question. Bivarin shel chaya b'shel ofos itzad mem Yom Tiv. If you have an enclosure, bivarin is like a pen, right? But an enclosure for a chaya and for an oaf, ein tzadin mehen b'Yom Tiv. You are not permitted to further trap an animal, even though it's in that enclosure on Yom Tiv. Ve'in nos nifnei mazonos. Furthermore, you can't go ahead and feed them. To which the Gemara says, Kasha chaya chaya, kasha ofos ofos. I both say that Beitzah directly contradicts our Mishnah. Because what did our Mishnah say? Our Mishnah said you are permitted to trap a chaya and an oaf that is in an enclosure. Right? Our Mishnah said explicitly you're allowed to. Yet the Beitzah said you're not allowed to. So what's going on over here? So bishlama chaya achaya lo kashya. So we'll say it's not a contradiction regarding chaya. Now remember again, just to define our terms, chaya and oaf are a bit more unique than behema. Behema is a domestic animal, right? Chaya is a non-domestic animal. Oaf, obviously fowl or birds. Says the Gemara, it's not a contradiction. I'll tell you why. Bishlama chaya lo kashya. Harabi Huda harabanon, two different opinions. This nan Rabbi Huda Omer Hatzad Tzipor Lemigdal Utzvi Labayis Chayiv. Rabbi Huda says that halacha l'maaseh, if you go ahead and on Shabbos, if you trap a bird in a migdal, in a tower, or you go ahead and you trap a deer in a home, chayiv. Your chayiv, remember, I'm going to say, just to be clear, tzeda, hunting / it's really trapping, is one of the 39 malachos. So therefore, again, Rabbi Huda holds, if you go ahead and you trap a bird in a migdal, in a tower, or a tzvi, or a deer into a home, you're chayiv. To which the Gemara says, L'bayis hu d'mechayiv. When do you see that you're chayiv? Only if you go ahead and you trap a deer in a home. Now we'll say, What's the difference between trapping a deer in a home versus bivarin? What's the difference? What do you think? So the difference is accessibility, right? The home is a much more constricted area versus the bivarin, which is a much larger area. So you see, Rabbi Huda is of the opinion that one is only in violation of the malacha of tzeda, not if simply one chases an animal into a confined area, but a significantly confined area. Aval bivarin lo. But if you were to just go ahead and chase the deer into a bivarin, into a pen, or into an enclosure, well, pen is the wrong word, enclosure, then halacha lemaisa, one would not be chayav for tzeda, which I will say tells you that if you put a tzvi in a bivarin, in a enclosure, that the tzvi is not considered trapped. Well, again, I will say, remember again, it's two sides of the same coin. If you're not chayiv on Shabbos, it also means that what? You can't really do it on Yom Tiv, right? Because remember again, trapping is only permitted on Yom Tiv when? Well, so actually that's a misleading statement. Trapping is not permitted on Yom Tiv. But when are you permitted to go in and capture the animal? When the animal is already considered to have been trapped / caught prior to Yom Tiv. The Chum say, Tzipor lemigdal, utzvi legina ulachatzer ulebivarin. Chachamim say no, that while it's true that a bird is considered to be trapped once you go ahead and you chase it into the migdal, ultimately again the deer, the tzvi, is once it gets into the garden or into the chatzer or into the bivarin. Ella ofos kasha. But how do you reconcile the contradiction regarding birds? V'chitema hanami lo kasha. Hababivar makura, hababivar shena makura. They would say it's not a contradiction. One is talking about a roofed enclosure, that's where the birds are trapped, and one is talking about an unroofed enclosure, that's where the birds aren't trapped. To which the Gemara says, Avaha bayis de ke bibar mikura dummy, but yet a home is like a roofed enclosure. Or bein Rabbi Huda bein Rabbanan, sipar lemigdal in labayis lo. And yet we see both, according to both opinions, the bird is only considered to be trapped when it's in a migdal, but not when it's in a bayis, even though the bayis has a roof. We'll say, what kind of bird are we dealing with over here? A tzipor durar. What's that tzipor durar? She'ena mekabelas moros. We'll say it's the type of bird, ultimately, again, that does not accept mastery. Not accept mastery. Look at Rashi. It's almost right across in Rashi. B'tzipor durar, shebara bebayis kibisada. This type of bird is able to live in the house as it is to live out in the field. Sheyodas lihishamet bizavios habayis. It knows how to hide itself in the corners of the home. Excuse me. Ulekach nikres durar al shem dira shedara bichol makom. We'll say, if you think about this, by the way, it's such an incredible use. So tzipor durar, right? Ukrasa durar la'aretz. By Yovel, the Torah used the lashon. Durar means freedom. Durar means freedom. So tzipor durar is a free bird, right? Free bird. Right? Namely, it could live anywhere. So we'll say, so therefore the Gemara says over here, by tzipor durar, that type of bird, even if it's in the home, may not be considered to be trapped because halacha lemaisa, it could go ahead and hide all of the corners. I will say, it's an incredible Musar Haskell on that also. What's the definition of freedom? What is the definition of freedom? It's the ability to go ahead and live anywhere. We'll say, meaning what? The ability of the definition of true freedom is the ability to adapt to any circumstance. You see, very often what happens in life is that we go ahead and we assume that we could only thrive, right? We could only thrive and we could only exist in certain situations, in certain circumstances. But Lamaisa, as soon as optimal circumstances are not there, we use that as an excuse to absent ourselves from life accomplishment. What's the tzipor durar? What's freedom? What's real freedom? If I'm a ben chorin, which we all like to think that we're a ben chorin, what does it mean to be a ben chorin? Be a ben chorin means you can live anywhere, right? Which means you could thrive and you could find a way to maximize your ability under any and all circumstances. So says the Gemara. So the Gemara goes weiter. So it becomes good. The Tana Devei Rabbi Shmuel, Lama Nikra Shma Tzipor Durar. Why is it called? Good, we did that. So the Gemara says, Hashda da Asis Lahachi. Now that we've explained this, Chaya achaya nami lo kasha. The truth is, when it comes to a chaya, right, when it comes ultimately again to the contradiction regarding animals, it's also not a contradiction. Ha bebivar katan, ha bebivar gadol. One is talking about a large enclosure, one is talking about a small enclosure. To which the Gemara says, by the way, hechi dami bivar katan. What does that mean? A small enclosure. So I'm sorry. Hechi dami bivar katan. Hechi dami bivar gadol. Amar Rashi, kol hecha. This is actually very helpful because now we actually get a definition. Kol hecha derahit abasura umatile bechad shachya bivar katan. V'idach bivar gadol. Let's listen to this. A small enclosure is when you could go ahead and run after the animal and catch the animal in one step. In one step, right? A large enclosure is where it'll take you a couple of steps. Good. Says so inami kol heicha diika ukzi beaver gadol. Or the other possibility is when the enclosure has a lot of corners. Now what's the chap if there are a lot of corners? A lot of places for the animal to hide. So if there's obviously for the animal to hide, that's called a large enclosure. The idach bivar katan inami. The other possibility we'll say is literally when the shadow of the walls overlap each other, that is called a bivar katan. Which I will say. So again, you hear the imagery. In other words, if the shadows of the walls overlap, that means the walls are very close to each other. That's called the bivar katan. But at the end of the day, if the shadows of the walls do not overlap, that's called a bivar gadol. Good. So we'll say, so again, a bunch of different definitions. We'll say again, the operative principle, just keep in mind the operative principle, is that halacha l'maisa, the only way to go ahead and quote unquote trap an animal on Yom Tov is how can you trap an animal? The real answer is you can't, right? But again, what allows you to go ahead, what allows you to engage in we'll call it a semi-act, an act of semi-trapping is if the animal is halachically considered trapped already prior to Yom Tov. Again, Rashi HaKadosh explaining to us why. Because the heter ochel nefesh is only for malachos which cannot have been done before Yom Tov with the same qualitative results. But anything that could have been done before Yom Tov with the same qualitative results may not be done on Yom Tov itself. Trapping is one of those malachos which could have been done before Yom Tov. Therefore, you don't have to have the animal in hand before Yom Tov, but halacha l'maisa, what has to happen? The animal has to be halachically trapped before Yom Tov. So the fish has to be trapped. The chaya, the oaf have to be trapped. So the Gemara says this: Lo kala bivar and shavin. Shmuel said not all enclosures are the same. Amar Rav Yosef. So we'll say, remember again, Rav Shmuel then essentially went on and said that halacha l'maisa, essentially, the animal has to be trapped, right? That's the rule. In other words, Rabbi Shmuel says, instead of getting into what kind of trap works, what kind of trap doesn't work, it's a very simple rule. The animal has to effectively be trapped prior to Yom Tov. Says the Gemara, Amar Rav Yosef Abraham Yehuda Amar Shmuel, Halach Reb Shimon Gamliel, the halacha follows Reb Shimon Gamliel, right? So Reb Shimon Gamliel says, as long as the animal is not mechusar tzeda, as long as it's not, literally translated, it means as long as it's not missing trapping, which means it's trapped, halacha so you could use it. Says the Gemara, Amar le Abaye halacha bichlal de pligi, but say first wide line chaf dalad amud aleph. Abaye said, oh, 1 second. The fact that you have to say halacha like Rabbi Shmuel, that sounds like maybe someone's arguing on that. Amar le umay nafka lechamina. So he said, what does it matter to you if somebody's arguing? In other words, we'll say, what does it matter? We just said halacha faz Rabbi Shmuel. Leave it alone. To which the Gemara says, Amar le Gemara zamar zamorta tehe. Is Gemara simply a song? Is Gemara simply a song? Now we'll say, now what does that mean? So remember again, what you have over here is you have Rav Yosef saying in the name of Rav Yehuda, you have Rav Yosef saying in the name of Rav Yehuda that halacha l'maisa, that the halacha follows Rav Shimon Gamliel. Abaye says back, if you need to make a declarative statement that the halacha follows someone, that indicates to us what? What? That someone else is arguing. To which Rav Yosef essentially says, what does it matter? In other words, who cares who someone's arguing, someone's not arguing? I just told you the halacha follows Rav Shimon Gamliel. To which Abaye responded, do you think Gemara is just the song, that it doesn't matter who the other opinion is? So we'll say what Abaye was saying was like this, and this is really an incredible yesod. Does it make a difference to the bottom line if someone is arguing on Reb Shimon Gamliel? It doesn't make a difference to the bottom line because halacha follows him. But ultimately, again, what Abai is saying is, in life, what's incredibly important is clarity. You see, when you sing a song, you don't need clarity. Why? Because what happens when you sing a song? What happens when you sing a song? What happens if you don't know a word in a song? Hum it, right? And it doesn't matter. And the truth is, it actually doesn't matter. This song could be just as beautiful. So when you sing the song, you don't know it, you don't know a stanza, you don't know a line, hum it, make it up, move your lips, whatever you need to do. But as long as you have the nigun, it doesn't really matter. Abai says, that's not Torah. That's not Torah. You see, with Zmirus, a little bit of ambiguity is just fine. You don't know a word, not a problem. The Zemer is still beautiful. In Torah, ambiguity is the antithesis of what it is we're trying to accomplish. So I will say the entire pursuit of Torah is the pursuit of clarity in life. Why do I learn Torah? Why do I learn Torah? Besides that, Hakadosh Baruch Hu commanded me to, and besides the fact that it's the most enjoyable thing in the world. At the end of the day, I learn Torah because I want clarity in life, because there's so much gray in the world, because there's so much ambiguity, because there are so many things that don't make sense. And I want life to make sense. I want me to make sense. I want the way I live to make sense. Torah dispels ambiguity. When you learn and you understand and you chap, then you begin to see the world, you begin to see life, and you begin to see yourself with clarity. Because the Rabbi says, I need clarity. I need clarity, which Rabbi tells you something amazing. You know, so often in life, we live with ambiguity, right? You know, I think for those of you who are doing the Smichas Chava program and have the opportunity to learn like halacha with clarity, we realize that, especially in halacha, there are so many things in life we walk through, are like, I think this is okay, right? I think this is okay. And so much of our Yiddishkeit is like iffy. I heard this, I learned this, I mentioned this, I read about this, and we kind of play so much of a guessing game with so much of what we do. And same thing in our avodas Hashem. Am I taking the right path, not taking the right path? Is this the right derech, not the right derech? The goal in life is clarity. And clarity only comes from Torah. Zmiris, you find with ambiguity. Torah, life, clarity. Says the Gemara, Ze'aklal, ha-mechusrat seida, hechidah mechusrat seida. So what's considered to be missing trapping? Amar Rav Yosef, Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Shmuel, kol she'omer, habei mitzuda v'natzudena. So we'll say a very simple rule. If you have to say, bring the trap so we could trap the animal, that means that what? That means that what? Animal's not trapped. Good. That's a pretty straightforward one. So the Gemara says, Amar Abaye, v'ha'avzin v'tarnagolin, sha'omrim haba mitzuda v'nitzudena. But yet again, here's a good example: chicken and geese, or chicken and ducks. Right? Where often a person will say that the animals might be in an enclosure, and a person will say, bring the trap. V'tanya, hatzad avzin v'tarnagolin v'yoni hadresios, or hardarsios, sorry, pater. But yet we learned that if you trap geese or chickens or Herodian pigeons, you pater, because these animals are considered to be trapped already. Supposed to say very interesting. It depends. Does an animal automatically come back to its coop at night? An animal which automatically comes back to its coop at night is considered to be trapped. An animal that doesn't automatically come back to its coop at night is mechusar tzeidah. Both say, by the way, you hear the incredible musar in that? What's the definition of being trapped? What's the definition of being trapped? Always coming back to your coop. Sometimes in life, we always revert back to the same exact habits. We fall into patterns of behavior which we cannot break. We constantly come back to the coop. So during the day, I'm out and about, I'm doing my thing. It looks like I have control over my life. But then at the end of the day, I always come back to the coop. I always come back to the same place. I always come back to the same behaviors. And the Gemara says, if you do that, you're trapped. That's not so, right? Such an animal, such a creature that always comes back to the same coop and is unable to break the habits of life. It's the paradigmatic example of being trapped. Such an incredible yesod. Says the Gemara, V'hariyoni shovach, v'yoni aliyah, d'ban l'kluvan la'erev. But yet, again, doves that live in a dovecote And ultimately, Yoni Aliyah literally are doves which live in the attic doves. Ultimately, which come back to their coop. V'tanya hatzad Yoni shalav Yoni Aliyah utzi parim shekanu b'tefichin v'biros chayiv. But yet we learned that Allah Chalamaysi, if you go ahead and trap any of these birds, ultimately again you're going to be chayiv. Oh, it's not just that they come back to the coop. They come back to the coop and they're reliant on a human master for food. But coming back to the coop, but not being dependent on the human master for food, ultimately again is not considered to be trapped. But an incredible yesod also. Rav Mari Amar Hani Avidi l'Rabuye v'Hani Lo Avidi l'Rabuye. So ultimately, again, Rav Mari says, what does it mean, Hani Avud l'Rabuye? If you look at the first wide line of Rashi, Hani Avidi l'Rabuye Yoni Shovach Asuin l'Hishamit v'Livrach M'nei Adam. We'll say, interestingly enough, apparently it's not even just going ahead and coming back to the coop or being dependent ultimately again on the human master for food, but when they're in the coop, do they still try to flee from the master? So these types of birds try to flee even when they're inside the enclosure. Others, the Gemara says, "V'hani lo avidi l'rabuye," to which the Gemara says, "Kulhu nami avidi l'rabuye lekluvan kamrinon." I'm sorry, "V'hani lo avidi l'rabuye." Kulhu nami avidi l'rabuye lekluvan kamrinon ta'avidi l'rabuye. So we'll say, interesting enough, but don't all birds go ahead and try to fly away when somebody tries to capture them? To which the Gemara says, you're right, it depends. Once they're already in the coop, do they still try to fly? So again, the Gemara makes a chilik between birds that are in the coop and try to fly, and birds that are in the coop and no longer try to fly. I will say, it's interesting, by the way, just b'derech hashkafa, that first the Gemara says a trapped bird is one that always goes out and comes back to the coop. Okay, and then the Gemara adds in the caveat, it comes back to the coop and it's dependent ultimately again on its master for food. Which I will say again, going back with our derech hashkafa with this, that going back to the coop ultimately represents constantly reverting back to the same habits in life. That's called trap. What does it mean being dependent on the master for food? That sometimes in life we're dependent on the approval of others, which is an incredible yesod. So often in life, whether we realize it or not, we need other people to approve of who we are, of what we are, and what we do. And that's also being trapped, right? When your life success is dependent on some type of human approval. And sometimes, everybody wants to know that they're appreciated and that they're recognized and that someone is in their corner and cheering for them. But we have to be so careful to who we need approval from and what we need approval for. If the mazonos has to come from the master, that's also called being trapped in life. All right, so that brings an end to that Mishnah. Now again, we're not finished with the sugi yet, but Lamaisa, the principles of Shimon Gamliel's principle. That's why the Gemara says, the halacha follows of Shimon Gamliel, which essentially says the animal needs to be trapped before Yom Tov. As you begin to see from this discussion, the definition of being trapped ultimately will depend animal to animal. Good. Says the Mishnah, well, it's a very interesting case. So now imagine the following scenario. You're going ahead and you have traps. You have traps that are put out Erev Yom Tov. So Mesulos Chaya va'of v'dagim. So you have traps for Chaya, Of, Dagim, Shasam Erev Yom Tov. You lay the traps ready Erev Yom Tov. Lo yital mehen b'Yom Tov. Boss says, now let's say you put out the traps Erev Yom Tov. Yom Tov morning, you're coming home from shul. You check the traps, and what do you find in the trap? Baruch Hashem, an animal. What's the halacha? You can't use that animal on Yom Tov. Now, why can't you use the animal on Yom Tov? Why not? Why not? Because there's a possibility it was trapped on Yom Tov. Ela imkin yodeh shenitolim Erev Yom Tov. Again, the only way for you to use the animal in that trap is if you know for sure it was trapped on Erev Yom Tov. But if you don't know it was trapped on Erev Yom Tov, then Allah Chalamaisi, you can't use it on Yom Tov. One time, a particular Gentile brought fish to Rabbi Gamliel on Yom Tov. Va'amar mutarin hein. Rabbi Gamliel says, technically speaking, the fish is mutar. However, I don't want to accept the fish from this guy. Rashi says, why doesn't he want to accept the fish from this guy? Sha'ani son o. I hate him, right? I hate him, right? So Gamliel says, I'm not taking the fish, but nothing to do with halacha. It just has to do with, I don't like the guy, so I don't want to take a gift from him. Okay, we'll see there. We'll see exactly what's going on over there. Says the Gemara, Ma'isa listar. So the Gemara says, I don't understand. The story sounds like it's contradicting the halacha, right? What was the halacha? If you find an animal in your trap on Yom Tiv, what's the halacha? What's the halacha? You can't use it. Why not? Why not? Safek that it was trapped yesterday. And there was a story of a guy who brought Rabbi Gamliel a fish on Yom Tiv. Rabbi Gamliel says, it's mutter, but I hate you, so I'm not taking it. What's the pshat? The Gemara says, V'achi katani, safek muchan aser. Well, so listen to this. If you have a safek, if the animal was, mucha means prepared, meaning if the animal was already trapped on Erev Yom Tiv. So I don't know. Was the animal trapped on Yom Tiv, trapped on Erev Yom Tiv? A safek ultimately is aser. Look at Rashi just a moment. Safek muchan, kilomar v'zusha, amarna lo yita mehen, safek, dahanu safek muchan, v'safek muktza, v'aser. V'aser lav divrei hakoli, ela plukta Rabbi Gamliel Yehoshua. We'll say we're going to see, essentially, by the way, what you have over here is a safek muktzah, which is very interesting. They are being machmir the safek muktzah, because muktzah is what? Muktzah is drabanan. So this is a situation of being machmir with a safek muktzah, which again we'll talk about. But the idea the Gemara is saying is, if you have an animal that was trapped and you don't know, was it trapped Erev Yom Tiv, was it trapped on Yom Tiv, it's a safek, halacha l'maisa, you have to go ahead and you have to assume that the safek is aser. To which the Gemara says, Rabbi Gamliel matir. Rabbi Gamliel says, safek muchan is going to be mutter. So the Gemara tells a story then to support Rabbi Gamliel's position. There was once a story of a guy who brought fish to Rabbi Gamliel. Rabbi Gamliel said, really? The fish is mutter. Now I will say, what was the case of the fish? Safek muchan. Was the fish caught already Erev Yom Tiv or on Yom Tiv itself? That was a safek. Rabbi Gamliel holds safek muchan is mutter. Ela she'ein rutzon lekabel imenu. I'm Rabbi Yehuda Shmuel. Ein halacha Rabbi Gamliel. So Rabbi Yehuda saying the Mishal, the halacha does not follow Rabbi Gamliel. Namely, the halacha follows the Tanakama. That's safek muchan. If you're not sure, was the fish caught before Yom Tiv or not, the safek will be aser. V'ika damasni la'aha. Others explain, or others go ahead and put the machlokes here. The sanya safek muchan. Rabbi Gamliel mater b'shua oser. If you have an animal and you're not sure, was it prepared, meaning caught, trapped, on Erev Yom Tiv or not, Rabbi Gamliel says it's mutar, Yeshua says it's aser. Rabbi Yehuda Amar Shmuel, halacha Rabbi Yoshua. So the halacha is like Rabbi Yoshua, namely, which is the Tanakam of our Mishnah, safek muchan is going to be aser. The Iga Damasni la'aha. Others framing in this brisa, this sanya Amud Beis, shochtin min hanigarim b'Yom Tiv. You could go ahead and shecht animals from the Nigarin on Yom Tiv. Now Rashi says, what's Shochtim and Nigarim? Tap Rashi. Shochtin chayos min bivarim, lefi shenitzodin va'omdin, va'al shem sha'osin sham nigre mayim v'charitzin l'shtos ha'chayos, karlu Nigarim. What's the Nigarim are bivarim. So enclosures. You can go ahead and take an animal from an enclosure, right? And you could shecht it on Yom Tiv. Avalo min areshtos ve'umina mechmoros. But you can't take an animal from a net or from a trap. Rabbi Shimon Elazar Omer, ba umatsan mikol kolan me'erev Yom Tiv. Both say, listen to this. This is not talking about traps. So just if you could imagine for a moment, you have a trap, right? So both say, so the trap, let's assume for a moment that the way this trap is just like a big net. Animal runs into the net gets dislodged from its two posts and ultimately traps the animal. Imagine for a moment now, let's assume this is a big net. So let's say you can't see the two ends, right, at the same time. So you're walking on Erev Yom Tiv. You're walking Erev Yom Tiv, and what happens? You see one of the sides of the trap is dislodged. Which means that what? There's an animal trapped in there. So you're walking out, so you didn't see the animal Erev Yom Tiv. All you saw was one side of the trap dislodged. Biyadua sheme Erev Yom Tiv nitzodu umutarin. So we'll say that's enough circumstantial evidence to tell you that what? The animal was already trapped Erev Yom Tiv, and ultimately, again, it's ready to go. I mean, it's prepared. However, bo matzam u'kam b'Yom Tiv, but if halacha l'maisa you come along and you see the trap on Yom Tiv, and on Yom Tiv, you see one of the sides of the trap dislodged, Biyadua shebiyom tov nitzodu va'asurin. All that tells you is what? That the animal was trapped on Yom Tiv, and therefore the animal will be asur. So we'll say, see what's happening over here? In this case, you don't see an animal. In this case, all you see is one side of the trap dislodged. So if you see the side of the trap dislodged on Erev Yom Tiv, that's enough to tell you that what? The animal was trapped on Erev Yom Tiv and therefore permitted for use on Yom Tiv itself. If, however, you only see it dislodged on Yom Tiv, then halacha l'maisa, you have to assume it was trapped on Yom Tiv, and therefore it'll be asur. To which the Gemara says, it doesn't make sense. Hagufa kashya, you just made an inherently contradictory statement. Watch this. Amrit ba umatsan mikol kolan me'erev Yom Tiv. On one hand, you said that if you're walking and you find a side of the trap dislodged on Erev Yom Tiv, biadua sheme Erev Yom Tiv nitzodu. Right? So again, I'm walking, I see the side of the trap dislodged. That tells me that the animal was trapped on Erev Yom Tiv. Taima deba umatzaan mikol kolan. Now, the reason I could assume the animal was trapped on Erev Yom Tiv was right. I'll say, why? Why? Because I saw the trap dislodged. In other words, on Erev Yom Tiv, there's circumstantial evidence that shows that this animal was already trapped. So the Gemara says, "Time of deba matzah mikol kolan hasveika." But I will say, let's say you come along and you don't know when the trap was dislodged. Was it dislodged on Erev Yom Tiv, on Yom Tiv? Ultimately, again, safek will be asur. Okay, so what we infer from case number one is safek asur. Yet, ema seifa, look at the seifa, ba'u matzah mikol kolan bi Yom Tiv. Yet we learn that if you come and you find the trap dislodged on Yom Tiv, bi'adua shebi Yom Tov nitzodu. If you find the trap dislodged on Yom Tiv, what does that tell you? When was it trapped? When was it trapped? On Yom Tiv itself. Now both say, now taima diba umatsan mikol kolan. The reason why you assume the animal was trapped on Yom Tiv is why? Because you found the trap dislodged on Yom Tiv. But what can you infer from that? Hasveika, right? If you're not sure when the trap was dislodged, then what? Me'erev Yom Tiv nitzadu umutarin. Then halacha l'maisa, you could assume that it was trapped on Erev Yom Tov and it should be mutar. So we'll say, you see what's just happening over here? We just have two contradictory inferences from the Reisha and the Seifa. To which the Gemara says, this is what it means to say, Ba'u matzah mikol kolan me'erev Yom Tov. If you're walking on Erev Yom Tov and you find the trap dislodged, bi'adua sheme Erev Yom Tov nitzodo umutarin. We'll say, ultimately, again, if you find that trap dislodged on Erev Yom Tiv, you could assume the animal was trapped as of Erev Yom Tiv. Therefore, again, the animal is permitted to you on Yom Tiv itself. What do we infer from that? Hasveika. But if you're not sure, if you have any doubt about when this animal was trapped, hasveika naaseh k'mishna tzodu b'Yom Tiv va'asurin. Ultimately, again, a safek case, you have to treat safek as if what? As if what? As if the animal was trapped on Yom Tiv, and halacha l'maiset will be asur. Incredible. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel, halacha Reb Shimon Elazar. Ultimately, again, and says Rav Yehuda named Shmuel, the halacha follows Shimon Elazar. Therefore, I will say again, this case is very interesting, because what the halacha says is as follows. See, I will say, the novelty of Reb Shimon Elazar is what? Do you need to see the animal trapped on Erev Yom Tiv? Do you need to see it? No. All you need is what? Circumstantial evidence that the animal was trapped. So as long as on Erev Yom Tiv you saw that the trap was dislodged, that's enough to tell me that the animal was trapped on Erev Yom Tiv and therefore fit for use on Yom Tiv. That's the kula. What's the chumrah? The chumrah is, if you're not sure, then what? You have to be machmir and assume the animal was trapped as of when? Yom Tiv, and therefore prohibited from use. Incredible. So let's go weiter. So the Gemara says, "Hello, good." Va'amar mutarin heim. So we'll say, so remember again. Now let's focus on the story, right? So Rabbi Gamliel, yeah, Rabbi Gamliel in the Mishnah. Remember, Rabbi Gamliel holds that safek muchan is mutar. If you're not sure when the animal was trapped, was it trapped Erev Yom Tiv, was it trapped Yom Tiv? On Yom Tiv, if you're not sure, safek is mutar. So yet there was a story where a guy brought Rabbi Gamliel fish. Right? It was safek muchan. Did he catch it? Did he not catch it? Rabbi Gamliel says it's mutar, but I don't like you, so I'm not eating it. Says the Gemara. Our mutarin name. Mutarin lamai. This is incredible. Rabbi Gamliel says that Safek Muchan is mutter. Safek Muchan mutter. If you're not sure, was the animal prepared? Right? Was it trapped? Erev Yom Tov, it's going to be mutter. Mutter for what? Watch this. Mutter for what? It's incredible. Mutter l'mai. Rav Amar mutter l'kabel. Rav says it's mutter that halacha l'maisa, you could accept it. In other words, if somebody gives you a gift, right? Halacha l'maisa, you could accept it. Look at Rashi, l'kabel, almost right across. Rashi says over here, Rashi says l'kabel, betiltul dekuli haylo achmir b'safik muchan delisru betiltul aval ba'achila lo shenur b'gamil. So we'll say Rav says that halacha l'maisa, you could accept it. You could accept the gift. You can't eat it. In other words, which is another way of saying it's not muktzah. It's not muktzah, right? So in other words, you can go ahead and you can move it, but halacha l'maisa, you can't eat it. But Levi says no, mutarin ba'achila. Levi says, I just want to point out, something very interesting. Remember, Rabbi Gamliel says, Safek Muchan Mutter. The Gemara just said, Allah Reb Shimon Elazar, who says, Safek Muchan Aser. So just keep that machlokes in mind. So according to Rabbi Gamliel, who says, Safek Muchan Mutter for what? Rav says mutter betiltel, you could carry it. It's not muktzah, but you can't eat it. And Levi says you're even allowed to eat it. Rashi says ka'amar Rabbi Gamliel the lab disfili Rav Levi Kvasi ela milse who the mefarsh. Fine. So Levi said mutter b'achila. Both say get ready for this. This is incredible, absolutely incredible. Amar Rav. Rav said, both say listen to this Gemara. Li olam al yimane adam atzmo mi beis hamedrash afilu sha'achos. A person should never prevent himself from being in the Beis Medrash even for 1 hour, which I will say, let's translate that contemporarily, right? Halacha l'maisa, don't miss shir. Don't miss shir. Why not? Listen to this. Da'ana v'levi havina kamei derebi. Because this is Rav talking. Me and Levi, right? Me and Levi, we're in shir with Rebbe. We're in shir with Rebbe. Right? So one time he was giving a shir, right? Rebbe was giving a shir about this topic, about Rabbi Gamliel's position by Safek Muchan, and what happened? In the evening during shir, so Rebbe said that according to Rabbi Gamliel, when we say that Safek Muchan is mutter, it means mutter ba'achila. B'tzafra, in the morning, Rebbe changed his mind. Amar mutarin lekabel. And Rebbe said, no, Safek Muchan, according to Rabbi Gamliel, means you're allowed to accept it. It's mutar betiltul, you could carry it, but it doesn't mean you could eat it. Both say, get ready for this. Ana dahavi be midrasha hajibi. So Rav says, I was in the Beis Medrash. So I heard Rebbe change his mind, and as a result, I went ahead and changed my position as well. Levi, the lo havi be midrasha, lo hadrbe. Levi missed shir that morning. So because he missed shir that morning, ultimately, again, the last thing he heard was the shir that Rebbe went ahead and gave that night. And therefore, again, he did not retract his opinion. He kept his original opinion, ultimately, again, about achila. We'll say, isn't this incredible? Li'olam al yimana adam atzmoy beis hamedrash afilu sha'achas. We'll say this, now obviously, there are some people who could be makayim this in the purest sense of always being in the Beis Medrash. We'll say, but for the rest of us, what it means is like this. If you make a commitment to something, you make a commitment to your learning, you make a commitment to a shir, whatever it might be. There's not a plug for this shir. Whatever you make a commitment to, honor your commitments. Honor your commitments. There's always an excuse for not showing up, or there's always an excuse for being late, or there's always an excuse. If you make a commitment, honor the commitment. Li'olam al yimana atzma mi beis hamedrash afilu sha'achas. Whatever your sha'achas is, right? Whatever your hour is, whatever your commitment is, honor it. Honor it. And don't make excuses. Because at the end of the day, well, the truth is in general, life success is all about honoring your commitments. It's not honoring your commitments to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, not honoring your commitments to yourself. If you make a commitment in your learning, you make a commitment to the Beis Medrash, ultimately show up. Says the Gemara Meisvei. Let's just call it, we'll stop over here. We'll pick up in Yahrzeit Hashem with the rest of this story tomorrow. To be also an incredible, beautiful daf tomorrow as well. Shkoyach. How are you?